I stood frozen in my mother's living room as she announced my sister's engagement to my boyfriend of 3 years. "Liam was never yours," Mom said, her voice slicing through me like glass. "Amy needed him more. You're strong. You'll survive." Amy smiled, her fingers wrapped around Liam's arm. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The grandfather clock ticked louder. My hands trembled at my sides. 20 guests watched me crumble in perfect silence. I didn't cry. I walked out and never looked back. 10 years passed. 10 years of building myself from nothing. 10 years of them believing I was struggling somewhere while I quietly became someone they couldn't imagine. When I sent invitations to my charity gala, they thought they were meeting a wealthy stranger. They dressed in their finest rehearsed, their smiles planned how to impress Mr. Hayes. They had no idea Mrs. Hayes was me. And when they finally saw my husband standing beside me, their faces turned pale because he was the one person they never expected. Have you ever been dismissed by the very people who should have believed in you most? My name is Brooke Barrett. I am 37 years old and I own a consulting firm that quietly generates $8 million a year. My family thinks I run a struggling little business somewhere far away. They have no idea who I have become, and for a long time I preferred it that way. I sat in my car outside my mother's house for 10 minutes before I could make myself walk to the door. The old Victorian looked exactly as it always had, white columns and manicured hedges, and that same rose bush my grandmother planted decades ago. I texted Daniel before stepping out. Arrived. Pray this ends in 3 hours. His response came immediately. I'm here if you need me. Love you. I tucked my phone away and smoothed my simple navy dress. Nothing too nice. Nothing that would invite questions. The front door opened before I reached it. My mother stood in the entrance wearing a cream-coloured silk blouse and her signature pearl earrings. Behind her, I could see Amy descending the staircase in a fitted emerald dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Mum's face lit up when she saw Amy. She opened her arms wide. There's my beautiful girl. That colour is stunning on you. They embraced like they hadn't seen each other in months, though I knew Amy visited nearly every week. Then Mum noticed me standing on the porch. Oh, Brooke, you made it. Her eyes travelled down my dress, then back up. No hug, no warmth. You came alone again. Your husband too busy to join his wife's family. The question dripped with familiar mockery. Daniel sends his regards, I said evenly. He's travelling for work. She turned away, already losing interest. Well, come in. Don't stand there letting the cold air in. And the house smelled like roast beef and expensive candles. Relatives milled about the living room. Cousins and aunts and my mother's friends from her garden club. I recognised most of them. They recognised me too, but their eyes slid past like I was furniture. The dining table had been set with Mum's best china. Place cards marked each seat with careful calligraphy. I found mine at the far end of the table, wedged between the kitchen door and my elderly great-aunt, who was already half asleep in her chair. Amy's card sat at the head of the table directly beside Mum. The seating arrangement told the whole story of our family in 12 place settings. Brooke, is that you? Aunt Margaret appeared at my elbow, champagne in hand. How is that little company of yours still keeping busy? It's doing fine, I said. That's nice, dear. She was already looking past me toward Amy. Amy, sweetheart, tell me about your promotion. Your mother says you're practically running that department now. Amy launched into a detailed account of her recent success, her voice carrying across the room. I stood there holding my untouched water glass while relatives gathered around her, like moths to a flame. No one asked me another question. Then the front door opened again. I felt him before I saw him. Something in my chest tightened an old wound, remembering how to ache. Liam walked in carrying a bottle of wine, his dark hair shorter than I remembered, his shoulders broader. He went straight to my mother and embraced her warmly. Happy birthday, Mum, he said. Mum! He called her Mum. My stomach dropped. Liam's eyes swept the room and found mine. For one heartbeat, something flickered across his face. Pain, guilt, regret. I could not tell. Then he looked away, moving to stand beside Amy like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Liam, sit here next to Amy," Mum said, gesturing to the chair at the head of the table. Amy slipped her arm through his, her fingers curling possessively around his bicep. She looked directly at me and smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had won a war I never knew we were fighting. Mum caught Amy's eye. Something passed between them, silent and knowing. And in that moment, I understood with absolute certainty whatever happened 10 years ago was not an accident. It was a plan. And I had been the only one who did not know. I needed air. The dining room had become suffocating, filled with laughter that excluded me and conversations that flowed around me like water around a stone. I excused myself quietly, though no one seemed to notice, and slipped through the kitchen toward the back porch. The evening air hit my face, cool and clean, carrying the scent of my mother's garden roses. I leaned against the railing and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for hours. Why did I keep coming back? Every year, I told myself it would be different. Every year, I sat at the end of the table and watched my family celebrate everything Amy was while pretending I barely existed. I was 37 years old. I had built a life, a career, a marriage filled with genuine love. Yet here I stood, still hoping my mother might look at me the way she looked at my sister. Still hoping for something that was never going to come. The screen door creaked behind me. I turned to see Aunt Carol stepping onto the porch, 2 glasses of water in her hands. She was my mother's younger sister, though the 2 women could not have been more different. Where my mother was sharp and calculating, Aunt Carol had always been soft, quiet, overlooked in much the same way I was. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing me a glass. "Thank you." She stood beside me at the railing, looking out at the garden. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said gently, still trying to endure them. I did not answer. I did not know how to. Aunt Carol sighed. "You remind me of myself 30 years ago, Brooke. I used to be just like you, silent, yielding. I thought if I was good enough, patient enough, agreeable enough, they would finally love me the way I needed. I spent years bending myself into whatever shape I thought would earn their approval." She paused. It never worked. The more I gave, the more they took. The quieter I became, the harder they pushed. Her words settled over me like a weight. I had never heard Aunt Carol speak this way before. She had always seemed content in her role at family gatherings, pleasant and undemanding, never causing friction. I had not realised she was carrying the same wounds I was. "What changed?" I asked. I stopped waiting for them to give me what I needed. I stopped expecting my sister to suddenly become the person I wish she was. Aunt Carol turned to look at me directly. "Brooke, if you don't stand up for yourself, no one is going to do it for you. Respect is not something that gets handed out freely in this family. You have to claim it back. You have to decide that your own worth matters more than their approval." The words hit me somewhere deep in a place I had protected for years. I had spent so long trying to earn love from people who seemed incapable of giving it. I had swallowed my hurt, bitten my tongue, accepted crumbs and called them enough. And none of it had changed anything. "Aunt Carol," I said quietly, "can I ask you something about the past?" "Of course." "Liam, 10 years ago, when everything fell apart between us, I always thought he just lost interest. I thought he chose Amy because she was better, prettier, more lovable. But tonight, seeing them together, seeing the way Mum looks at him, like he belongs to her." I trailed off, not sure how to finish. Aunt Carol's expression shifted. Something dark flickered across her face. "You don't know, do you?" "Know what?" She glanced toward the house, lowering her voice. 10 years ago, your mother did not just disapprove of Liam. She did not simply hope you two would break up. She did something, Brooke. Something deliberate to separate you. My heart began to pound. What do you mean? What did she do? Aunt Carol opened her mouth to answer, but before she could speak, the screen door swung open. My cousin Marcus stuck his head out. Aunt Carol, Mum wants you inside. Something about the cake. Aunt Carol hesitated, frustration flickering in her eyes. She squeezed my arm. We will talk more later, I promise. Then she was gone, leaving me alone on the porch with her words ringing in my ears. She did something. I stood there for several minutes, my mind racing. What had my mother done? What could she possibly have done that was bad enough to destroy a 3-year relationship, to turn the man I loved into a stranger who would not meet my eyes? My phone buzzed in my pocket. Daniel? I answered immediately, grateful for the sound of his voice. How's it going? He asked. About as well as you'd expect. That bad. Worse. But I'm managing. I talked to him for a few minutes, letting his steady calm anchor me. When we hung up, I felt slightly more solid, more capable of walking back into that house. I returned through the kitchen and headed toward the living room where I had left my purse on a side chair. But as I rounded the corner, I stopped cold. Amy was crouched beside the chair, my purse open in her hands. She was rifling through it, pulling out my wallet, flipping through the contents. What are you doing? Amy's head snapped up. For half a second, guilt flashed across her face. Then she smiled smooth and practiced. Oh, Brooke, you startled me. I saw your lipstick fall out. I was just putting it back. I looked at my purse. My lipstick was still zipped in the inside pocket, where I always kept it. Nothing had fallen out. Thank you, I said flatly, taking my purse from her hands. Amy straightened, brushing invisible dust from her dress. You should be more careful with your things. She walked away without another word, rejoining the party like nothing had happened. I stood there holding my purse, my hands trembling slightly. Amy had been searching for something. Information about my life, my husband, my work. She wanted to know what I was hiding. And underneath my anger, Aunt Carol's words kept echoing. She did something. The pain I had carried for 10 years, the heartbreak I had blamed on fate, and my own inadequacy. The silence from Liam that I had interpreted as rejection. What if none of it had been real? What if every bit of it had been manufactured by my own mother? The question haunted me through the rest of the evening. I moved through the party like a ghost, smiling when required, nodding at conversations I barely heard. My mind kept circling back to what Aunt Carol had said, to the look on Amy's face when I caught her with my purse, to the way my mother orchestrated everything in this family, like a conductor leading an orchestra only she could hear. I found myself drifting into memory, back to a time when I believed in love and trusted that the people closest to me would never deliberately hurt me. 10 years ago, I was 27 and completely in love with Liam Mitchell. We had been together for 2 years, and he had started talking about marriage. I remember the afternoon he showed me the ring he was saving for a modest diamond that he was paying off month by month. I told him I did not need anything expensive. I just needed him. We were young and hopeful and certain that our future was secure. Then my mother found out. She called me into her study one evening, her face tight with controlled fury. You cannot marry him, she said. I asked her why. I genuinely did not understand. Liam was kind, hard-working, devoted to me. He came from a good family. His father owned a small accounting firm. There was nothing about him that should have triggered my mother's disapproval. But she looked at me with cold eyes and said, He is not worthy of this family. End it, Brooke. I will not ask twice. I refused. I told her I loved him and that her opinion would not change my mind. She said nothing more that night, but I should have known better. My mother never lost gracefully. She simply changed tactics. What I did not know, then what I am only now beginning to piece together, is that my mother had investigated Liam's family. She discovered that his father had been involved in a minor accounting error years earlier, a mistake that was corrected and forgotten. But in my mother's hands, that error became a weapon. She gathered documents, twisted the facts, and created a narrative that could destroy a man's reputation and send him to prison if she chose to use it. Then she met with Liam privately. I can only imagine how that conversation went. A 25-year-old boy sitting across from my mother, being told that his father's freedom depended on his next decision. "Either you leave Brooke," she must have said, "or I will make sure your father goes to prison." Liam was terrified. He loved me, but he loved his father too. He did not know what to do, so he did the only thing he thought would protect everyone. He disappeared from my life without explanation. But he did not disappear silently. He wrote to me, letter after letter, trying to explain, trying to reach me, waiting desperately for a response that never came. And I never received a single one of those letters, because Amy intercepted everyone. My sister, who had secretly wanted Liam for herself, saw an opportunity and took it. She made sure his words never reached me. She let me believe he had simply stopped caring. She let him believe I was ignoring him. The misunderstanding that shattered my heart was not an accident. It was engineered by my own family. I did not know any of this as I stood in my mother's living room 10 years later, watching Amy pour herself another glass of wine. She had been drinking steadily all evening, her movements growing looser, her smile sharper. At some point, she wandered over to where I was standing alone by the window. Her eyes glittered with something cruel. "You know," she said, her voice slightly slurred, "I always wondered if you ever figured it out." "I figured what out?" Amy laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Do you know how many letters Liam wrote you? God, it was pathetic. Every week for months, waiting for replies that never came. He actually thought you would write back." She shook her head, amused by a joke only she understood. So desperate, so sad. I felt the blood drain from my face. Letters. What letters? But Amy had already turned away, drifting back toward the crowd, leaving me standing there with her words ringing in my ears. Letters. Liam wrote me letters. The party wound down slowly. Guests began to leave, hugging my mother, congratulating her on another wonderful year. I should have left too. Instead, I offered to help clean up gathering plates and glasses, carrying them to the kitchen while my mind raced. When the house finally grew quiet and my mother retired to her room, I made my move. Amy's bedroom was at the end of the upstairs hallway. I slipped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The room was exactly as I remembered it, pink and pristine, everything in its proper place. I searched methodically, checking drawers and closets, looking for anything that might hold old papers. Finally, on the top shelf of her closet, I found a wooden box tucked behind a stack of sweaters. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of envelopes yellowed with age, all addressed to me in handwriting I recognized instantly. Liam's handwriting. I pulled out the first letter and unfolded it carefully. "Brooke, why won't you answer? I wait every day for some word from you. Please tell me what I did wrong. I love you. I will always love you. Please just tell me you're okay." My throat tightened. I opened another letter, then another. Each one was more desperate than the last. Each one begged for a response I never knew I was supposed to give. 10 years! He wrote to me for months. He waited. He hoped. And I never knew, because my sister stole every single letter and hid them in this box like trophies of her victory. I was still kneeling there, letters scattered around me, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Amy stood in the doorway, her face pale, all traces of drunkenness gone. "You found them," she whispered. I rose slowly to my feet, the letters clutched in my hands. Amy stood frozen in the doorway, her earlier arrogance stripped away, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, with 10 years of lies finally coming to light. "How long have you hidden these?" My voice shook, but I forced myself to hold steady. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. Amy's expression shifted as she regained her composure. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, crossing her arms over her chest. Brooke, you need to calm down. You don't understand the situation. And then explain it to me. Explain why you have dozens of letters that were addressed to me, letters I never received. Letters that might have changed everything. I did it for you. Amy's voice took on a tone of practiced patience as though she was speaking to a child. Liam was not worthy of you. He was not worthy of this family. I was protecting you from making a terrible mistake. Protecting me. I stared at her in disbelief. You stole my letters. You let me believe the man I loved had abandoned me without a word. You watched me grieve for months and you said nothing. Because it was the right thing to do. You would have thrown your life away on him. Mum agreed. We both knew what was best for you, even if you couldn't see it yourself. The rage that had been building inside me finally found its voice. Not worthy, or was it because you wanted him for yourself? Because that is what happened, isn't it, Amy? You saw something. I had something good and you decided to take it. Just like you have taken everything else. Amy's mask slipped. Her eyes flashed with anger. You always thought you were so special. The quiet one, the smart one, the one everyone felt sorry for. But you never fought for anything. You just let things happen to you. Liam needed someone who would actually hold on to him, and that was never going to be you. Our voices had risen without either of us noticing. The door swung open and my mother appeared in the hallway, her face tight with irritation. What is going on here? I could hear you two from downstairs. I turned to face her, holding up the letters. Did you know about these? My mother's eyes moved to the papers in my hand. For one brief moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Then her expression hardened into stone. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. Where did you find those in Amy's closet, hidden like evidence of a crime, which I suppose they are? I could hear the bitterness in my own voice. 10 years ago, Liam wrote me letter after letter. He tried to reach me. He wanted to explain, and Amy intercepted every single one. Did you know? My mother did not flinch. She did not apologize. She did not even pretend to feel remorse. Instead, she looked at me with the same cold calculation I had seen my entire life and said, I did what was necessary for this family. Amy needed Liam more than you did. You have always been strong, Brooke. You can take care of yourself. Amy is different. She needs support. She needs someone to build a life with. I made a decision that benefited everyone. I laughed. The sound came out harsh and broken. You destroyed my relationship. Let me spend a decade believing I was unlovable, and you justify it by calling me strong. That is your excuse, that I could survive the damage, so it was acceptable to inflict it. I do not expect you to understand. You have always been too emotional to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture. I repeated the words slowly, tasting their poison. You mean the picture where Amy gets everything she wants, and I get nothing? My mother's voice turned to ice. Liam was never yours. He was always meant for Amy. And in 3 months, they are getting married. That is final. The announcement landed like a physical blow. I had suspected it had seen the way they moved together at the party, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way I had not been prepared for. Behind my mother, Amy smiled. It was a small, triumphant smile, the smile of someone who had won a war I never knew we were fighting. Movement in the hallway caught my attention. Liam stood just outside the door, his face pale, his eyes filled with something that looked like anguish. He had heard everything. He stood there silently, making no move to defend himself, no move to explain, no move to do anything at all. He was exactly what he had always been, a man too afraid to fight for what he wanted. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister. I looked at the man I had once loved more than anything in the world. And something inside me shifted. The desperate need for their approval, the hope that one day They might see me as worthy of love, the pain of believing I was never enough. All of it began to crystallize into something harder, something colder, something that felt almost like freedom. "Congratulations, little sister," I said. My voice was eerily calm, even to my own ears. "I hope you find happiness with what you stole." I walked past them without another word. Down the stairs, through the living room, out the front door. No one followed me. No one called my name. I climbed into my car and sat in the darkness for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Then, I pulled out my phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Brooke, is everything okay? I need to talk to you. I need to tell you everything that happened tonight." I paused, feeling the weight of the decision forming in my chest. "And I think I am finally ready." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Daniel's voice came through steady and warm. "I will be waiting. Come home." I drove through the city in a daze, the streetlights blurring past my windows, my mind replaying everything that had happened. The letters, my mother's cold justification, Amy's triumphant smile, Liam standing silent in the hallway, too weak to speak a single word in his own defense. By the time I pulled into the parking garage of our building, my hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a numbness that spread through my entire body. Daniel was waiting for me when I walked through the door. He took one look at my face and opened his arms without a word. I stepped into his embrace and let him hold me for a long time, my cheek pressed against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He did not ask questions. He did not push. He simply held me until I was ready to speak. We sat together on the couch and I told him everything. The letters hidden in Amy's closet. The realization that Liam had tried to reach me for months after we separated. My mother's confession that she had deliberately destroyed my relationship because Amy needed Liam more than I did. The engagement announcement delivered like a final slap across the face. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he took my hands in his. "What do you want to do?" I stared at our intertwined fingers, trying to sort through the chaos in my head. "I don't know. Part of me wants to walk away, cut them off completely, never see any of them again, and just let them fade into the past where they belong. And the other part..." I hesitated. The words felt dangerous to speak aloud, as though saying them would commit me to a path I could not turn back from. "The other part of me wants them to know who I really am. I have spent 10 years letting them believe I was nothing, a failure, someone who barely survived while Amy thrived. I let them think that because it was easier than fighting, but now..." I trailed off, unsure how to finish. Daniel finished for me. "Now, you want them to see the truth." I nodded slowly. "Is that wrong? Is it petty to want them to realize they were wrong about me?" "It is human." Daniel squeezed my hands gently. "You spent a decade building something extraordinary, and the people who should have been proudest of you never even noticed. That kind of pain does not disappear just because you have moved on. Sometimes you need to close the chapter properly before you can truly let go." I leaned back against the couch, letting my mind drift to the years that had brought me here. After I left my mother's house 10 years ago, I had nothing. No savings, no connections, no support from the family that should have been my foundation. I rented a tiny apartment with money borrowed from Aunt Carol, the only person who believed I could make something of myself. I worked 18-hour days, taking any consulting job I could find, building a reputation one client at a time. There were nights I ate instant noodles for dinner because I could not afford anything else. There were mornings I woke up wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by walking away from everything I knew. But I kept going. I kept pushing. And slowly, impossibly, things began to change. My consulting firm grew from a one-woman operation into a company that generated millions in revenue. I became known in certain circles as someone who could turn failing businesses around, someone whose advice was worth its weight in gold. Eventually, I became what industry insiders called a shadow consultant, working behind the scenes on major investment deals, advising clients whose names would have made my mother's head spin. What she never knew, what none of them ever knew, was that some of those deals were ones my family had tried desperately to be part of. They submitted proposals, they called in favours, they did everything they could to get a seat at the table. And I was the one who quietly recommended they be rejected. Not out of revenge, but because I knew the truth about how they operated. I knew the corners they cut, the lies they told, the way they used people, and discarded them when they were no longer useful. I protected my clients from my own family, and my family never had any idea. Then I met Daniel. It was at a business conference 3 years after I started my firm. He was giving a keynote speech about ethical investing, and something about the way he spoke caught my attention. He was successful without being arrogant, wealthy without being flashy. When we talked afterward, he asked about my work with genuine curiosity, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone truly saw me. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and when we married, it was a simple ceremony with a handful of close friends. I did not invite my family. I did not even tell them. They learned about my marriage through distant relatives, and when my mother called demanding to know why she had been excluded, I simply said, "You would not have come anyway." My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me back to the present. I glanced at the screen, a group message from my cousin sharing photos from Amy's engagement celebration. The comments were flooding in. "So beautiful. What a perfect couple. Amy, you deserve all the happiness in the world." I scrolled past them, feeling nothing but a dull ache in my chest. Another message appeared. This one was private from my mother. "At least you knew not to cause trouble tonight. That was wise." I stared at the words, anger flickering beneath my numbness. Even now, after everything, she could not resist one final jab. One final reminder that I was expected to stay silent, stay small, stay out of the way, while Amy claimed everything that should have been shared. My phone rang. Liam's name flashed across the screen. I answered before I could talk myself out of it. "Brooke, please, I need to explain." His voice was desperate, strained. "I had no choice. Your mother threatened my father. She had documents that could have destroyed him. I was 25 years old. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I just left, if I just disappeared, it would protect everyone. I wrote you so many letters trying to explain, but you never answered, and I thought you hated me." "I never received those letters," I said flatly. Amy took them. Silence on the other end. Then quietly, "Oh God. You had 10 years to find another way to reach me. 10 years to fight for what we had. But you didn't. You chose the easy path, and now you're marrying my sister." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "It's too late now, Liam. There is nothing left to explain." I hung up before he could respond. Daniel watched me set the phone down. "Are you okay?" "No," I admitted, "but I will be." I looked at the calendar on the wall. The Hayes Foundation annual charity gala was scheduled for 3 months from now. It was the biggest event of the year, attended by executives, politicians, philanthropists. My family had tried for years to get an invitation. They never succeeded. A plan began to form in my mind, crystallizing with sudden clarity. "Daniel, I want to invite them to the gala." He studied my face for a moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. Then he smiled. "I think it's time your family learned who their daughter really is." I sat down at my desk and pulled out a sheet of cream-coloured stationery embossed with the Hayes Foundation logo. I wrote carefully, each word deliberate. "Dear Barrett family, you are cordially invited to the Hayes Foundation Charity Gala. Dress code, black tie." I did not sign it as Brooke. I signed it as Mrs. Daniel Hayes. The invitation arrived at my mother's house 3 days later. I know this because Aunt Carol called me that evening, her voice a mixture of amusement and disbelief. She told me my mother had been sitting in the living room when she opened the envelope, and her eyes went wide the moment she saw the Hayes Foundation letterhead. According to Aunt Carol, my mother immediately called Amy into the room, and the two of them spent the next hour researching everything they could find about Daniel Hayes and his investment company. Amy discovered that Hayes Investment Group was considering a major partnership with Sterling Corp, the firm where Liam worked as a mid-level executive. My mother's mind went straight to opportunity. If they could impress Mr. Hayes at the gala, if they could make the right connections, Liam's career would be secured and Amy's future along with it. They spent days discussing what to wear, how to behave, which talking points might appeal to a man of Daniel's stature. Not once did either of them pause to wonder why the invitation had come to them in the first place. Not once did they look closely at the signature at the bottom. Mrs. Daniel Hayes meant nothing to them. They assumed it was simply the wife of some wealthy stranger, a woman they would meet and charm at the party. They had no idea they were walking into an evening designed by the daughter they had dismissed for a decade. 2 weeks after sending the invitation, I met Aunt Carol at a quiet cafe on the other side of the city. She looked nervous when she arrived, glancing around as though she expected my mother to appear at any moment. I ordered her a cup of tea and waited until she had settled into her chair before asking the question that had been burning in my mind since the night of my mother's birthday party. "Auntie, you told me my mother did something to separate me and Liam. You said you had proof. I need to see it." Aunt Carol's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "I kept it all these years, Brooke. I did not know what to do with it. I did not know if it was my place to interfere, but I could not bring myself to destroy it either." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small bundle of papers yellowed with age and tied together with a faded ribbon. She handed them to me, and I untied the ribbon carefully, my heart pounding as I unfolded the first page. It was a letter in my mother's handwriting, addressed to Liam. The words were precise and cold, exactly the way my mother spoke when she wanted to make someone understand that she held all the power. She wrote that she knew about his father's accounting error, that she had obtained documents proving his involvement in what she called financial irregularities. She wrote that if Liam did not end his relationship with me immediately and permanently, she would ensure those documents reached the authorities. She would destroy his father's reputation, his career, his freedom. She gave him 1 week to decide. There were more letters, follow-ups, reminders, each one more threatening than the last. I read them all with a growing sense of horror, finally understanding the full scope of what had been done to me. "How did you get these?" I asked. "Liam gave them to me," Aunt Carol said quietly. "About 5 years after you left. He showed up at my door one night looking like he had not slept in weeks. He said he could not carry the weight of them anymore, but he was too afraid to destroy them. He thought maybe someday they would be needed as proof of what your mother had done. He did not know who else to trust." I sat in silence processing this new information. Liam had kept these letters for years. He had given them to someone he hoped would protect them. And yet, he had never found the courage to come to me directly, to fight for the truth, to break free from the cage my mother had built around him. A few days later, Liam contacted me again. This time, I agreed to meet him, though I kept my voice cold and my expectations low. We sat across from each other in a park near my office, and he told me the full story of his imprisonment. My mother's threats had worked exactly as she intended. He was 25 years old when she confronted him, terrified of what would happen to his father if he refused to comply. He ended our relationship believing it was the only way to protect his family. But the trap did not end there. When Amy began pursuing him, a few years later, she made it clear that she now possessed the same documents my mother had used. If Liam refused to date her, if he tried to leave, if he did anything to embarrass her, she would release everything. His father would be ruined. His family would be destroyed. So Liam stayed. He played the role of the devoted boyfriend, then the devoted fiancé, all while knowing he was living a lie. "I had no choice," he said, his voice breaking. "I was trapped." I looked at him for a long moment before responding. "You always had a choice, Liam. You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth. You could have fought, but you didn't. You chose to surrender, and now you're marrying my sister because you're still too afraid to stand up for yourself." He flinched at my words, but he did not argue. He knew I was right. What I did not tell him was that I understood his fear. I understood what it felt like to be controlled by my mother, to believe that resistance was futile, to accept crumbs because fighting for more seemed impossible. Liam was a victim, but he was also a coward. And I could not save someone who refused to save himself. Over the following weeks, Daniel quietly assembled a team to investigate the documents my mother had been using as leverage. He hired a forensic accountant to examine the original records from Liam's father's accounting firm. The investigation took nearly 2 months, but the conclusion was clear. The irregularity my mother had exploited was a system error, a glitch in the software that had created false entries. Liam's father had done nothing wrong. There was no fraud, no embezzlement, no crime. The documents my mother possessed were worthless. They proved nothing except her own willingness to manipulate and destroy. Daniel delivered the news to me one evening over dinner. "Your mother's leverage is gone," he said. "Every threat she made was built on a foundation of lies. Liam just does not know it yet." I nodded slowly, feeling another piece of the puzzle click into place. The night before the gala, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, wearing a deep red gown that flowed to the floor like liquid fire. Daniel stepped behind me and fastened a diamond necklace around my throat, his fingers warm against my skin. Our eyes met in the mirror. "Ready?" he asked. I took a deep breath, looking at the woman reflected back at me. She was not the broken girl who had fled her mother's house 10 years ago. She was not the invisible daughter who sat at the end of the table, waiting for scraps of affection. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who was finally ready to claim what she deserved. Ready. The ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel had been transformed into a vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across hundreds of guests dressed in their finest attire. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. I watched from a private room upstairs as the guests arrived, my eyes searching for the 3 faces I knew would appear. Daniel stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my back. "They're here," he said quietly. I looked down and saw them enter through the main doors. My mother walked in first, wearing what I recognized as her most expensive dress, a deep blue gown she had been saving for years for an occasion she deemed worthy. She held her head high, scanning the room with the confident smile of a woman who believed she belonged among the wealthy and powerful. Behind her came Amy and Liam, arm in arm, playing the role of the perfect couple. Amy wore emerald green, her hair swept up in an elaborate style, diamonds glittering at her ears. Liam looked tense despite his tailored suit, his eyes moving restlessly through the crowd, as though searching for something he could not name. A hostess approached them and checked their names against the guest list. I watched my mother's face light up when she was informed they had been seated at the VIP table near the front of the room. She turned to Amy with a triumphant smile, and I could almost hear her voice in my head. "They must know who we are. This is our opportunity." They had no idea they were walking into the evening I had spent 3 months designing. The minutes passed slowly as more guests arrived and took their seats. The ballroom filled with the hum of conversation and laughter. My mother worked the room as best she could, introducing herself to anyone who seemed important, dropping hints about her family's business interests and her future son-in-law's position at Sterling Corp. Amy stayed close to Liam, her fingers wrapped possessively around his arm, smiling her practiced smile at anyone who looked their way. They were performing just as they always performed, presenting the image of success and happiness they wanted the world to see. At precisely 8 o'clock, the lights dimmed. The string quartet fell silent. A spotlight illuminated the stage at the front of the room, and the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening for the annual Hayes Foundation Charity Gala. Your generosity tonight will support educational programs for underprivileged youth across our region." He paused, letting the applause wash over the room. "And now it is my great honour to introduce your hosts for this evening. Please welcome Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Hayes." The spotlight swung to the grand staircase at the side of the ballroom. Daniel took my hand and squeezed it gently. Together, we stepped into the light and began our descent. I kept my eyes forward as we walked down the stairs, but I could feel the exact moment my family saw me. The gasp that cut through the applause, the sudden stillness at the VIP table. Daniel and I reached the bottom of the staircase and walked toward the stage, and I finally allowed myself to look at them. My mother's face had drained of all colour. She sat frozen in her chair, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, staring at me as though she were seeing a ghost. Beside her, Amy's expression had shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. Her champagne glass hovered in midair, suspended in a moment of shock. And Liam stood motionless, his face a mask of emotions I could not begin to untangle. Guilt, shame, regret, recognition of everything he had lost. Daniel guided me onto the stage and stepped up to the microphone. His voice was warm and steady as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Before we begin the evening's programme, I want to take a moment to introduce someone very special." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with pride and love. "This is my wife, Brooke Hayes. Many of you know me as the face of Hayes Investment Group, but what you may not know is that Brooke is the strategic mind behind 40% of our major investment decisions. She built her own consulting firm from nothing, starting with no connections and no support, and grew it into a company that now generates $8 million annually. She is brilliant, resilient, and compassionate. She is the heart of everything I do, and I am honoured to stand beside her tonight." The applause that followed was thunderous. I smiled and nodded graciously, accepting the recognition I had earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. At the VIP table, my family sat in stunned silence. My mother's carefully constructed composure had cracked completely. Amy looked like she might be sick. Liam had sunk back into his chair, unable to meet my eyes. Daniel waited for the applause to fade before continuing. "I also have a brief business announcement to share with you all this evening. As many of you know, Hayes Investment Group has been in discussions with Sterling Corp regarding a potential partnership." He paused, and I saw Liam lean forward slightly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "After conducting thorough due diligence over the past several months, we have decided that Hayes Investment Group will not be moving forward with this partnership. Our standards for ethical business practices were not met." The words landed like stones in still water. No accusations, no defamation, just clean, professional business language that anyone in the room would understand. But I knew what it meant to my family. The partnership they had been counting on to secure Liam's career advancement was gone. The connections they had hoped to make through Daniel were now worthless. Every plan my mother had made when she opened that invitation had just collapsed around her. I watched her face as the reality sank in. For a moment she sat perfectly still, processing what had happened. Then something shifted in her expression. She rose from her chair, smoothing her dress, forcing a smile onto her face. She began walking toward the stage, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, there must be some misunderstanding. If I could just have a moment to explain our family's situation, I am certain we can clear up whatever concerns you might have about Sterling Corp. You see, my future son-in-law..." She stopped mid-sentence. Everyone in the room turned to see what had caught her attention. Aunt Carol was walking toward the stage from the opposite side of the ballroom. She moved slowly but deliberately, her shoulders straight, her chin held high. In her hands she carried a large envelope, and her eyes were fixed directly on my mother. My mother's forced smile faltered. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear flash across her face. Aunt Carol reached the stage and climbed the steps with a dignity I had never seen in her before. She walked past my mother without a glance and approached the microphone. The ballroom had fallen completely silent. Every guest watched with rapt attention, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. "My name is Carol," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I am Brooke's aunt, and I am also the younger sister of the woman who just tried to interrupt this evening." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. For 30 years, I watched my sister manipulate everyone around her. I watched her control scheme and destroy anything that threatened her vision of how things should be. I stayed silent because I was afraid. I told myself it was not my place to interfere. But 10 years ago, she did something I could not ignore. She destroyed her own daughter's happiness, and I have carried the evidence of that crime ever since. Aunt Carol opened the envelope in her hands and removed a stack of papers. She held them up for everyone to see. "These are handwritten letters from my sister to a young man named Liam Mitchell. 10 years ago, Liam was in love with Brooke. They were planning to marry. My sister disapproved, not because Liam was unworthy, but because she had decided he would be more useful as a husband for her other daughter, Amy." She began reading from the first letter. "If you do not end your relationship with Brooke immediately, I will ensure your father faces criminal charges for embezzlement. I have documents that prove his guilt. You have 1 week to decide." Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Aunt Carol continued reading letter after letter, each one more damning than the last. Threats, demands, ultimatums, all written in my mother's own handwriting, her signature at the bottom of every page. There was no recording to question, no hearsay to dismiss. This was physical evidence that could not be denied. When Aunt Carol finished, she looked directly at my mother. "You destroyed your daughter's chance at happiness because it did not fit your plans. You used blackmail to control a young man who had done nothing wrong. And you let Brooke believe for 10 years that she was not worth fighting for." She stepped back from the microphone. "I should have spoken up sooner. I am sorry I did not." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from the VIP table, Liam rose to his feet. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but something in his expression had changed. He looked like a man who had finally decided to stop running. "Everything she said is true," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "I was a coward. I let Mrs. Barrett control me for a decade because I was too afraid to fight back. I let Amy blackmail me into this engagement because she held the same threats over my head." He turned to face Amy, who was staring at him with wide, panicked eyes. "I cannot continue this lie. The engagement is over." Amy shot to her feet, her composure shattering completely. "You cannot do this. I have the documents. I will release everything. Your father will be destroyed." Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. "Those documents have been reviewed by forensic accountants over the past 3 months. The irregularities in Mr. Mitchell's father's records were the result of a system error in the accounting software. There was no fraud. There was no embezzlement. There was no crime. The evidence your family has been using as leverage for 10 years proves nothing except your willingness to threaten an innocent man." He paused. "There is nothing to threaten anymore." Amy's face went white. She sank back into her chair as though her legs could no longer support her weight. Beside her, my mother finally moved. She walked toward the stage, her chin still held high, attempting to salvage what remained of her dignity. "This is a family misunderstanding," she said, her voice strained but controlled. "I apologize for the disruption. We will discuss this privately and resolve any concerns." She attempted a smile, but it faltered on her lips. The guests nearest to her were already turning away, whispering to each other. Business associates she had courted all evening were gathering their things and heading for the exits. Her carefully constructed image built over decades of manipulation and performance was crumbling in real time. 2 security guards approached her politely but firmly. "Ma'am, we need to ask you to leave." My mother looked at them, then at me. For one long moment our eyes met. I saw rage there, and beneath it something that might have been fear. She opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. She allowed the guards to escort her toward the door, Amy trailing behind her like a shadow. I stepped up to the microphone one last time. "I want to thank everyone for your patience this evening. What you witnessed was not planned as public entertainment. It was simply the truth finally coming to light." I paused, gathering my thoughts. I did not do this for revenge. I did it because I deserved to know the truth about my own life. Because everyone in this room deserved to know who they were really dealing with. I looked toward the exit where my mother had disappeared. "I forgive you, not for your sake, but for my own peace. Carrying hatred is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my life. But I will never go back. That door is closed forever." The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks. My mother faced an investigation for coercion and extortion based on the letters Aunt Carol had preserved. Her business partners, horrified by the public exposure, cancelled their contracts one by one. When her loans were recalled early due to the scandal, she was forced to sell her house to cover the debts. Amy was terminated from Sterling Corp. Within days, the company unwilling to associate with someone whose family had become synonymous with manipulation and blackmail. She lost her social standing, her connections, her carefully curated life. She moved back in with our mother, 2 women whose schemes had finally caught up with them. Liam was free, but freedom came with its own price. He had to rebuild his life from nothing, starting over at 38, with nothing but regret and a decade of wasted years behind him. He sent me a letter a few weeks after the gala. He did not ask for forgiveness. He only wanted me to know that he was sorry, that he thought about what might have been, that he hoped I had found the happiness I deserved. I read his letter once, then put it away. There was nothing left to say to him. One evening, Daniel and I sat together in our garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I held a letter from Aunt Carol in my hands. "I am proud of you," she had written. "You did what I could not do 30 years ago. You stood up, you told the truth, you set yourself free." Daniel looked at me. "Any regrets?" I considered the question carefully. "I am sad it had to happen. I wish my family had been different. I wish I had not needed to expose them to find peace." I shook my head slowly. "But I am not sorry I stood up. I am not sorry I finally claimed my own worth." I looked at the fading light, feeling something I had not felt in years. Stillness, contentment, freedom. For 10 years they told me I was not enough. They made me believe I needed their approval to matter. But I know the truth now. I never needed them to see my value. I just needed to see it myself. And that was when I realised my life had finally, truly begun. Brooke's story reminds us of something we often forget. Our worth is not determined by the people who fail to see it. She spent 10 years believing she was invisible, unlovable, not enough. But the truth was she had always been enough. She just needed to stop waiting for permission to believe it. Sometimes the people who should love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. And sometimes the only way to find peace is to stop seeking approval from those who were never willing to give it. If this story touched your heart, if you have ever felt overlooked or undervalued by the people closest to you, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from family to find yourself? Have you ever discovered that your greatest strength came from your hardest moments? Your stories matter, and this community is a place where we lift each other up. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Every subscription helps us continue bringing you powerful stories of strength, resilience, and redemption. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth was never theirs to decide.